Welcome to the Battle Archive. Since 2005, the Academy of Ideas has organised the Battle of Ideas Festival, with debates on the key cultural, political and scientific issues of the day. We are proud to be the home for unfettered debate, the People's Parliament, the place where new ideas come alive in open discussion. And now, we are opening our vault, making our recordings of public debate available to you, free to revisit and share as often as you like. For more free speech content and news on our next festival, subscribe below or head to academyofideas.org.uk. But for now, enjoy the discussion.
Ladies and gents, hello, welcome. Thanks for sticking with us through to this, one of the final sessions here at the Battle of Ideas Festival. This session, Kamala Mania, Trump and the Vibes election. I'm delighted to be chairing this session, really important issue that I'm sure many of us are following closely. I'm Jacob Reynolds. I'm the head of policy for MCC Brussels, as well as an associate fellow at the Academy of Ideas. I want to do something slightly different with this session. If you've been here at the weekend, we're late, it's kind of maybe people are lagging slightly, but I want to turn this into a little bit more of a conversation about the election, not least because, well, we wrote this session out and we're thinking about it when Kamala Harris had just been kind of foisted to the forefront and made, by committee meeting, effectively the Democratic nominee. And so at the time it seemed that you could conjure into existence a kind of fake enthusiasm for a candidate that was called Kamala Mania. And if you guys have been following things as they've been developing over the last few weeks, then I mean, the session already, by the title slightly feels outdated because things have changed quite a lot. So I want to dig into kind of where we're at now, what's happened to the issues that are supposed to characterize this election, and kind of this sense that the American political system is becoming so dysfunctional that it's almost impossible to manage the kind of big fractious country that is the United States of America. To guide us through, I'll just introduce our panelists very, very quickly. So from left to right, starting with Nick Dixon, who's a comedian, a presenter at GB News and the host of the show The Current Thing. Then sitting next to me on my left is Stan Swim, who's the Chief Program Officer of the Bill of Rights Institute and our token American on the panel. And then on my right here is Dr. Richard Johnson, who's a writer and a senior lecturer in politics at Queen Mary University London. And then furthest over there is Dr. Cheryl Hudson, who's a lecturer in US political history at the University of Liverpool and the author of Citizenship in Chicago, Race, Culture, and the Remaking of American Identity. Now, I mean, Nick, I alluded to this in the introduction. We said Kamala Mania, but is that already a thing of the past? Has she kind of fallen flat? What's happened from that supposedly kind of triumphant anointing of Queen Kamala? What's gone wrong?
Okay, great question. Can I just quickly say, I thought we were going to start with like a 5-minute set. I had this whole stand-up thing planned. It was going to be so funny.
It was going to be that funny.
Just imagine how funny that was going to be. You'll never hear that. Because our esteemed chair said no formal speeches. I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do a formal speech, but of course I'm going to do a 5-minute statement. But apparently it's all just questions. It's just kind of a loose hippie vibe. So let me try and... Just a couple of quick caveats at the top. This is called the Vibes election. I didn't realize I'm on with like serious political professors. My background is stand-up comedy, so can I just quickly say I think I'm the Vibes panelist here. So you'll only get vibes from me. Thank you. We've got some Vibes fans. And so I am the Vibes. And I also want to quickly say it's always a little bit obnoxious to comment on another country and give political prescriptions. I don't really like it when people do it to my country. I think there's a slight exception here, though, because we did invent America. So I'm going to allow it. Shots fired. And I am sat on the far left, but that's the only far left thing you'll get from me today. You can tell from my choice of drink which team I'm on. What would Donald do is what I always ask. Anyway, I'll answer your question now. I've done enough banter. So Kamala Mania was very short-lived because it was entirely based on nothing, wasn't it? It was just like, oh no, we've got this candidate that probably even Obama didn't want. He's like, there's going to be a fair and free process, and everyone's like, no, we're just going with Kamala. Oh, okay, so even Barack was shocked, and they just plonked in Kamala. No one wanted her, so the media was like, oh no, we've got to make this candidate who's notoriously awful, no one votes for, no one likes, has no opinions, no thought. We're going to have to make her something. And they go, oh, she's brat. And you're like, okay, I mean, brat's a noun, that doesn't even make sense, but all right, I mean, but I understand it's come from some cultural thing, so she's brat. And they're like, yeah, Kamala, she's new. You thought you knew the old Kamala. This is the new Kamala. She's the same person, but now we're desperate. So So to me, Kamalamania was always just a puff of smoke and was always going to evaporate as soon as she had to do any actual interviews, and I think that's what we've seen.
Yeah, great. And Cheryl, I mean, one of the things that we did focus on a little bit in the blurb and in the session is the sense that maybe uniquely among American elections, the kind of complete absence of anything resembling substance and issues. And so we reflected on this as kind of calling it the vibes election. What have you made? What's really missing from the debate around the election?
So in August, when I was invited to come on the panel, and I was told it was about Kamala Mania, I said, by October there will be no Kamala Mania. Like, it was obvious to me that it was a very short-lived thing. Basically, it came out of the fact that everybody understood that Joe Biden couldn't be the candidate. He was going to lose. Nobody else in the Democratic Party wanted that poison chalice. She was the only possible candidate that they could put up. And so when she was put forward and replaced Biden, there was just such a massive sense of relief that Biden was not going to be the candidate, So there was a bounce in the polls, and she went crazy over social media and everything. But the thing about vibes, and everyone was talking about Brat Summer, we had the Brat Summer, but vibes are a sign that politics is empty, that it's hollowed out, that there is a real disconnect between voters and the political class that are supposed to represent them. Vibes kind of fill that vacuum in a sense. But I think it's really important to kind of get into what those vibes are. What vibes are the candidates putting out? They do mean something. There is something important about the vibes that they think that the voters need to feel. That sort of emotional comfort that they're getting from their candidates. Daddy Trump and Mamala,
Yeah, no, great. I mean, the other side of things then, Stan, Trump. Like, it seemed to me, especially in the early stages of the campaign, Trump was kind of going on these random podcasts, and it didn't seem like we had the old Trump, that he wasn't necessarily firing on all cylinders. Has something changed there, or where do things stand with Trump?
Well, I don't know, but as the panel's token American, as I walked out of Victoria Station earlier today past one of the theaters, I thought I could hear somebody singing, "You'll be back." I don't know. I think there was pretty clear momentum for Trump when he thought his opponent was Joe Biden. He was sharper than Biden seemed to be. But he's never been a massively popular fella, and neither has Kamala, for that matter. And so I think we're going to a situation where at least I find myself struggling to get excited about either choice, and I think there's a healthy chunk of the country that's in the same boat. You start with a Kamala Mania, but if you look at kind of the barometers that we might use in the States, a Real Clear Politics poll for the average there, for example, this race looks pretty dead even to me. And so I'm not sure that the momentum that either side may see extends much beyond their own base.
Yeah, and Richard, reflecting a bit on I touched on it in the opening, the sense that America has just almost become too unwieldy. The political system is kind of, I don't know whether it's captured just by the old parties and they're kind of responsive, but like, what do you make of this sense that the system itself seems to be stuck in a bit of paralysis, not just by the fact that the candidates were or are a little bit old, but this whole sense the system's kind of unresponsive now?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen in the United States is what we call a massive ideological sorting. So the political parties used to be quite ideologically heterogeneous. So you'd have conservative Democrats and you'd have liberal Republicans, and the parties were, in American terms, Big Tent, we call it broad church. The parties now are much more ideologically coherent and consistent. People on the right of politics vote Republican, people on the left of politics vote Democrat. Now, from a outside US perspective, that isn't too surprising. That's the way that politics works in many other countries. But in the United States system, this causes problems because of the high level of what we call in political science veto players, the checks in the system, the need to get through the House, the Senate, the President, and so on. Add to that a country that's very evenly divided. I think since the year 2000, no Democrat or Republican presidential candidate has received less than 45% of the vote, and none has received more than 52% of the vote. And in this election, we can expect the candidate to fall within that range as well. And so there's a winner-take-all mentality in the parties, but there isn't a winner-take-all system to deliver the policies that those parties are standing for. And what that just tends to mean is you get stuck with gridlock.
Yeah, great. And Nick, coming back to you, I mean, when Trump was shot, and then he stood up and he raised his fist, and there was this kind of triumphant moment, and it was the American flag was in the background, and you thought for a moment, right, this is the moment, this is the kind of key point in the election that's going to swing it, and Trump after this is going to be able to make huge amount out of this kind of key moment. And then, I mean, to me, and even lots of my friends are really sympathetic to Trump, you kind of felt he came up with, he didn't have much to say on it. He couldn't kind of transform that moment into something else. But what was your take on that?
Okay, yeah. Well, one of the questions in the blurb was, is this election, how important is it? And I'm like, well, it's quite important because they keep trying to kill one of the candidates. So that implies to me someone cares. Enough to be shot in the head, and which is what happens when you try and kill the president. So, yeah, but you're absolutely right. There was a moment where it's like, right, Trump's won it because he said fight, fight, fight. But our news cycle is so absurd that about a week later it was like, well, that's done. And he tried to sort of bring it up in the debate, I think, and it was just sort of moved on from very quickly by the entirely neutral moderator. And so, yeah, it was incredible how quick that moment moved on. Though it's still in people's minds, I think, and we don't know how Kamala would have reacted, but we can imagine it wouldn't have been the same, and obviously Biden wouldn't have done the same. So I think it is still significant, not as significant as it should have been, but I also think that Trump's already basically won. He's playing music, he's chilling out, he's got a playlist. I feel like the vibe is that he's already basically won it, unless they default to what I call the rig or kill strategy, which. They can always rig or kill, and the thing is, because I don't think they will rig it this time, because it's much harder to rig it when you've got the world's richest man ready to sue you, which Elon Musk would presumably do. You've got Silicon Valley. Obviously, they didn't rig it last time either. It's all banter, this. And I'm not saying they're directly responsible for the shootings either and the assassination attempts, but there is this stochastic terrorism that the left has given us, so they're responsible in one way or another. So they could always default to that, but I basically think Trump's won it if it's a fair election.
Yeah, and Cheryl, I think like the last couple of times Trump ran, and the first time he won, there was obviously, I think a lot of people identified this as a real populist moment in American politics. It probably was. I understand or think that maybe something's changed a little bit with Trump. Some people are writing that he's kind of lost his populist touch. There's no longer the kind of Steve Bannon machine kind of behind him. What do you make of that? Is Trump even still a populist? Was he ever?
I think he was a populist, and 2016 really ripped up the rules. It changed the game, and I don't think that it's recovered since then. So I think he's moved the discussion on, so that a lot of the Democratic response to him, I mean, he's kind of taken over the Republican Party. Nobody can oppose him from within it. But the Democrats try to play him at his own game now. So they are taking on his policies. They're trying to, this whole vibes thing comes from him, right? So it's so you associate it with Kamala Mania, but actually Donald Trump also embraces those vibes, and I do think it's worth getting into what these vibes mean, what they represent in American political life, because and what vibes are attached to each of the candidates. So with Kamala, when I was thinking about this, it's like, right, what are her vibes? Apart from the wine mum or whatever. Like, she represents, vibes are emotions, right? They want to encourage an emotional attachment from voters, rather than one based on politics or political interest or kind of rational thought about solutions for political problems. We just want a kind of a shallower emotional attachment. And so Kamala's vibe is joy, right? This is what she kind of put out there, is joy, this is what we want, but also fear, right? So they've both got flip sides of their vibe. So the fear is Russia, the fear is fascism, coming from Trump, the dictator, and on Trump's side, the vibes are hate. On the negative side, there's hate, so there's hate towards the immigrants, there's hate towards China, but then also fun, right? So his kind of more positive equivalent is fun rather than joy. So what's the difference between joy and fear? I mean, there's been lots of talk about the negative stuff, the fear and the hate, but the joy and the fun are really interesting to me in a way of like positively motivating voters to identify with the candidates. Are they trying to manipulate the emotions? Are they trying to fill this kind of vacuum of meaning that exists? And I think that joy means it kind of represents a lasting contentment. It's more permanent, right, than fun. So fun is this fleeting experience of pleasure. And my best example of that is when Trump went back to the place where he experienced the assassination attempt, and he was giving another talk, another rally in the same spot. He opens his talk with, as I was saying, right? So it's like, this is the way that he combats the fear narrative, because when you're having fun, you don't feel fear, right?
Okay.
So that's...
Yeah, no, good. We'll come back to this. Stan, pick up on these things if you like, but I know you're also interested in the kind of a more granular perspective and the distinction between the coverage, which at least in the UK, is often kind of very national versus actually what's going on in the individual states. But pick up on this if you like.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a nationalization that at least from my view, started with the 1994 election when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans successfully nationalized a whole bunch of issues to win the House. And that was a real earthquake in American politics. I think we can argue over what degree this might be the case, but it seemed to me that shifted a lot of the media oxygen to the national landscape. But that isn't the only place where American governance occurs. America is a nation of 50 states, and those states each have very robust systems by design. 45% of the total spending on government that occurs in the state occurs in state and municipal governments. And there's a lot more robust conversation happening among governors and legislatures. You see more heterodox solutions to things. And so in that way, the national presidential election gets a bit cartoonish for me compared to what's going on at a substantive level in many of these other states. So you have a state like Vermont, which can elect Bernie Sanders as a senator and has a Republican governor who is the most popular governor in the country within his own state. I could give more examples like that, but I think there's a lot going on under the surface that is different from the hyperbolic picture that you see at the top between the two presidential candidates.
Yeah, and I mean, Richard, does this link back to your kind of point about the ungovernability or the difficulty in kind of governing America? I mean, one suggestion would be kind of return some of the power to the states, but what's your take on this?
Well, I would agree that we don't pay enough attention to the states. When I teach US politics, one of the things I do try to do with our students is take them outside of Washington, D.C., at least in conceptual terms, and to think about different controversies that are happening in the states on just even, say, the point of we'd look at the 51 constitutions of the United States, not just one, because each state has their own constitution. But on the ungovernability point at the federal level, I mean, it is worth saying that with this kind of ideological sorting, what it does mean is that if you do have your ducks all in a row, if you do have unified control of Congress, you are able to get more through in a consistent kind of ideological policy line than you once were. You don't have to compromise as much if you do control the House, the Senate, and the White House, and have a way to evade the filibuster in the Senate, which there are certain ways to do so. And in this respect, I would argue that what we've seen really is the tragedy of the Joe Biden election is that in policy terms, he was the most legislatively successful Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson. He invested more in the US economy than any president since Franklin Roosevelt. Depends how you measure it, but if you just take Biden's four biggest spending bills, the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, if you just take those four, that came to $800 billion. That came to $4.2 trillion. Now, the New Deal, in inflation-adjusted terms, was $800 billion. So in just 2 years, Joe Biden was able, in inflation-adjusted terms, to far outspend what the Franklin Roosevelt spent in the New Deal throughout the 1930s. And even if you calculate it in terms of percent of GDP, which some economists say is a better way of doing it, Biden's spending was about half in the first 2 years of his presidency, was about half of Franklin Roosevelt's throughout the 1930s in social programs. Now, people, maybe many in the room, would disagree with that, but actually from a perspective of kind of old-fashioned left-wing material politics, Biden was very successful in that regard, but he's been a disaster at selling that because Donald Trump has been very successful in shaping the culture. And I was struck when I was in the US for a couple of months earlier this year, when Biden was still the nominee, that all of the attention was on Donald Trump. You know, Biden was like a sideshow, even though he's the president of the United States, and people were just interested in Donald Trump. And Biden has just been, partly because of his age, for other reasons, I think he's had bad political advice, he's just been unable to sell a coherent and compelling narrative about his presidency, and I think that has been a tragedy for him, even if whether or not you agree with that.
Great. All right, one last question to all of the panel, and then we'll come out. But try and nail it. What's at stake in this election, and as a result, who's going to or who should win?
What's at stake?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a massive election in terms of what's at stake. Although I tend to think even if Trump wins, it's just a slowing down of decline, but it's still a massive difference. I mean, if you talk about war, Trump always likes to boast those wars wouldn't have happened with him. I tend to believe him. Then if you look at censorship, Hillary Clinton's talking about bringing in Section 230. They're obsessed with censoring Twitter. You could talk about the economy. You could talk about the Constitution. John Kerry wants to change the First Amendment and things like this. So I think there's a big question of how far is Trump really something different? Is he a real, if you go to like things like elite theory, is he a real counter-elite? You've now got Musk on board, you've got RFK Jr. on board, so it's kind of an interesting potential counter-elite, and you've got Vance, who is a potentially more radical figure if they sort of listen to him. So the question of how different will Trump actually be, I think probably it'll be an attempt to return to a kind of 90s liberalism. You'll have high-skilled immigration, which Musk is really into. You'll have free speech and all that sort of thing. So it probably won't be that radical, but it's still a massive improvement on what it will be with Kamala Harris, which will just be a complete disaster in all regards.
Yeah, Stan,
so I'm on the fence.
What's at stake?
Yeah, he sounds on the fence to me. For me, this comes down to whether or not our political leadership is actually willing to listen to more than their most ardent cheerleaders. And in a nation that wants to somehow be unified, that's 330 or so million people. I mean, what is it, 7 or 8 times the population of Britain? It is ungovernable in certain ways, and I don't know if it was meant to be governed in a really thick way, but you can't have the kind of disconnect that I think exists between parties and the country for all that long without needing to have some sort of really significant bruising of those parties. I don't, and so to me, whichever party ends up on the short stick on election night, I wonder what kind of conversation they will have internally and whether it will allow them to break some of this logjam by re-engaging with a wider part of the political electorate. That sort of compromise in our system doesn't occur by building parliamentary coalitions. It's supposed to occur in the broad church or the big tent sort of sense, where the parties are supposed to be the mechanism for that. They're not doing a great job of it right now. I think at the margins, the Trump coalition might be open to a little more heterodoxy, it seems to me, and so maybe there's something happening there, but I don't think you can look at it and say that they're listening to the other side in a particularly attentive way. And so you're going to see really significant disappointment no matter which way this thing goes. And to me, the real question is, will the losing party learn anything, and how much will that delay the learning on the part of the winner?
Great, nice point. Richard, what's at stake?
Well, I think in legislative terms, we shouldn't expect a great deal from either president, because it's quite likely that there will be divided government, that the Senate is likely to go in Republican hands, and I think there's a good possibility that the Democrats could win the House. I mean, there's a greater chance that there'll be unified Republican control, and so Trump might have a bit of leeway to pursue a certain legislative agenda. But I have to say that when he was president the first time and he had unified control of Congress for the first 2 years, he had a very light legislative agenda. He preferred to do things through the executive branch, which are quicker and require less compromise, but are less durable and less far-reaching than legislation. I expect probably what we'll see is a fight over the tax cuts and the continuation of the tax cuts. But really, I think the most potentially significant political battle of the next president's term will be who replaces Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. Okay, Clarence Thomas has been a member of the Supreme Court since 1991. He's still younger than both Biden and Trump. He's
not saying much.
It's not saying much, but he's 76. But if Trump wins, it's very likely that Clarence Thomas will retire, and his fight will be to get through a nominee through the Senate, which could be very closely divided. Even if it's a Republican Senate, he might have a couple of recalcitrant Republicans like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who might not like a more radical choice. And you have to remember, Thomas is probably the most conservative member of the court. And so Trump needs to be able to replace him in his kind of political project terms with someone who's equally conservative. And that may be a challenge. If Harris wins, I think Thomas will stay on the court, but a bit like in the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as they start to get a bit older, then questions emerge as to whether they leave the court in involuntary ways.
Yeah, great. Cheryl?
What's at stake, I think, really is the legitimacy of political leadership and really of the American political system. Interesting fact is that if Trump wins, Kamala Harris is going to have to verify the election results, right? So that would be really interesting after the January 6th thing, and to see how the Democrats would handle the loss, because, you know, despite all of the rhetoric, Hillary Clinton did a lot of work in delegitimizing Trump when he beat her to the presidency. So, you know, the question of democracy circulates the whether the president is accepted by half of the country, the other half, you know, the losing half. The issues that are at stake are the economy. Despite all the money that Biden has spent, Americans are not feeling the benefit of it, which, you know, debatable whether they did in the New Deal, but there was a kind of sense of there were social programs for the people. I don't think the American people are feeling the impact of all of the money that's been spent by the Democrats, and in fact they see the Inflation Reduction Act as actually increasing inflation a lot of the time. So there's three issues. One is the economy. Two is immigration, which is, you know, obviously we have a similar issue here in the UK and in Europe. Difficult question. And then abortion is another issue. And I think, you know, the economy and immigration fall for Trump. The abortion issue, I think, falls for Kamala. The problem is that on all of those things, in different ways, neither of the candidates really have any solutions. You know, this is why they're falling back on vibes. And however, you know, interesting this discussion about emotions are, you really need to have some kind of rational approach to the political issues that confront the country. My preference, I guess, if you're asking us, is would be for Trump to take the presidency, because he at least recognizes that there is a problem. Right? Make America great again means that, you know, at the moment it's going on the wrong track and it needs to change course.
Sure. Great, thanks. Let's come out to the audience. I'm looking for the volunteers who's got the microphones. Okay, put your hand up if you want to speak. We'll take quite a few rounds of questions.
I'd be curious to know the panel's opinion on the notion that some politicians on the American left, as well as the media, are responsible to a degree for the assassination attempts on Donald Trump because of the rhetoric that he is a threat to democracy. Conversely, I'd be curious on your opinions on how the American right also plays into that.
Great, thank you very much. Right.
All right, Jacob, I want to take exception to something you actually said.
Good.
I think that You had said that after the excitement with Trump and after the assassination attempt that he kind of went nowhere. But I look at it as on the difference between this election in 2016 and 2020, he's been much more measured. He's been less bombastic as a rule. The tweets, all of that stuff has gone way down. So I think you see a much more serious candidate than you did. And when you directly compare, when they let Kamala Harris actually open her mouth, we see that there's nothing behind it. She is the DEI candidate for President of the United States. She is what you get when DEI takes over a country, in my opinion. And he is actually, you see him much more substantive, talking to serious people, and with Kennedy and Musk, it looks like they've actually got a plan to do some really positive things with
Yeah, no, very good. I mean, I'd ask, what's the point of Trump if he's not bombastic? But right.
But made the comment about how the political parties used to be big tents and the desire to move back towards that. I guess my question is, how feasible is that these days without going back to an identity-based voting pattern, i.e. Republicans are for big business and Democrats are for the workers, or however. How can you do that if there isn't going to be some sort of ideological alignment within it and sort of at least a North Star? And especially in the context, and coming back to what's at stake, is that just the sheer fact of the amount of things that the state does and the amount of power that the state has over individuals' lives is what makes it increasingly and almost, on a one-way course to becoming more and more significant and more at stake. Whereas actually the only way to sort of lower the stakes is to reduce what the state is doing, so that it doesn't matter who wins in effect.
Great, thanks. Let's take this lady here, then I'll get some thoughts from the panel.
So I'm really interested in this idea about America becoming ungovernable. And from my sort of potted knowledge of American history and the ideals of the founding fathers for what the business of government is, right up until perhaps the New Deal that you were talking about, in the terms of how much the government intervenes in people's lives. And we see that in this country now. We get a lot more interventionists, particularly on the kind of social and cultural level, rather than just sort of on the economic one. So I'm just wondering, how much is this idea of this sort of interventionist government making a country as big, diverse, and with all the different 50 states, how much is that contributing to that sense?
Okay, great, thanks. Let's get a few reflections. Nick, can I start with you?
Yeah, well, which question? Because there's so many. The first one I've got stuff on, which I already alluded to when I mentioned stochastic terrorism. This term comes from a Democrat blog, I believe, but if you look at Wikipedia, which you can still rely on for some things, it says that it's a form of political violence instigated by hostile public rhetoric directed at a group or individual. Unlike incitement to terrorism, stochastic terrorism is accomplished with indirect, vague, or coded language. So I think maybe it's just pure incitement to terrorism. But, you look at what they've done with Trump. Yes, they're definitely, at least in part, responsible. You don't suddenly have a slew of assassination attempts for no reason. And notice, as Musk sort of waggishly pointed out, they're not happening in the other direction. So they're only happening, as far as we can tell, there may be some attempts we don't know about on Biden or something, or that far less known. Trump's actually had so many. Even before the most famous one recently, there were multiple incidents involving ricin. There was one where someone tried to grab a policeman's gun. There was one that's deemed a bit less serious involving a forklift truck. But if you look at them, there's been about 10 of these things. So that obviously the rhetoric of semi-fascist and MAGA fascist and all this kind of stuff, the endless examples of rhetoric, you could definitely say have contributed to that. And then there were so many other questions. I was still thinking about the first question, and then someone passed me a little note, so I lost track. So I'll pass that on to someone else.
We'll come back to you. Stan, pick up on whatever you like.
If I could, I'd like to blend the question from Mo here in the front with the question from the back. Started by talking about kind of governability and big tents, because I think those two things are connected. I think it is going to be tougher to do a great tent, because there has actually been something going on underneath all of this called the Great Sort, where you have Americans moving to geographies where people think more like they do. And part of this has been driven by geographical attendance at schools, as well as some other sorts of things that go on. But what that means is that there has actually been physical sorting of the country, not just ideological sorting. That makes the Big Tent Project a tougher thing to figure out. And so I I wonder if there won't be some new alliances along other sorts of lines as people get frustrated or as this starts to break. The other thing that I would say is that I do think that interventionism comes with its own problems. Our federal government in our federal constitution was given a fairly limited remit. And the office of the presidency in particular was fairly limited. So we're having this argument back and forth over the single most important job in the United States, but it's not supposed to be that. The most important single job, not the single most, but the most important single job, I would argue, is legislator. The largest piece of our Constitution is Article 1, what Congress does, what it can do. And so, to me, when we start to have the government get into things, by its nature, government can really only use force, so it makes a lot of one-size-fits-none things that somehow we're all supposed to be happy about. Sooner or later, that doesn't work, and so you end up having more problems back and forth, where if you let the federalism structure work, then you actually have an opportunity for at least 50 different solutions where people can work things out, make a few messes, make them on a smaller scale, hopefully, and then sort things out in a way that works. And you do see this kind of exchange back and forth among the states now. Not enough of it makes its way to Congress.
Great, thanks. Richard?
Yes, so on this question about can you recreate the Big Ten parties, I mean, I don't think so, and I think we're likely to see an increased intensification of partisan polarization. And actually, this will now be driven mostly by non-white voters. So white voters are quite ideologically sorted into the camps, but non-white voters have traditionally stuck more with the Democrats, even those who are ideologically conservative. So to give you an example, for years, about a third of African Americans have identified as conservative, obviously small c conservative in the American sense, not in the UK sense, and about 80% of those nonetheless voted Democratic. Okay, so about 80% of black conservatives have consistently voted Democratic. And even at the last election, where there was a bit of movement, only 29% of self-identified black conservatives voted Republican. So in contrast, something like 93% of white conservatives voted Republican. But what I think we are seeing, and we've started to see it already in the last couple of cycles with Latino voters, and I think we will see it in this election to a certain extent with black voters, is that black and Hispanic conservatives are shifting into the Republican Party. This will make the Democratic Party more liberal in ideological terms, and it also will have an electoral penalty for the Democrats at the election, where they could lose this election on the basis that, and this is a prediction I'm going to make here, that Harris, I think, will get the lowest share of the non-white vote of any Democratic presidential nominee since the 1960s.
Great, thanks. We'll come back and we'll hold you to it later. Right, Cheryl.
Yeah, so on the question of does the media rhetoric or whatever lead to the assassination attempt, I'm actually a little bit hesitant or cautious about arguing that, because I think that in the end, what that says is that these people who took shots at Trump were somehow manipulated, their minds were manipulated by the media, and what it leads to in the end is censorship. Like, that's the bottom line. And I think one of the great things about America is the First Amendment and freedom of speech being guaranteed, which I think is actually being eroded and challenged, and that is something which should be defended, and not arguments about whether speech causes action. Same thing with January 6th, whether speech causes action, that is very tenuous. You can't establish that, and it does just lead to censorship. On Kamala being a DEI candidate, I think that the problem with Kamala's candidacy is much more about its erosion of democratic norms, right? So the Democratic Party has made, under Biden, has made a big deal about what a threat to democracy Trump is. At the same time, they have used the law to go after him in this kind of lawfare way where they used impeachment against him. They've kind of politically motivated legal challenges, which tend to be based on very dubious, novel legal theories, right, which are kind of made up on the spot and which target him as an individual. So the thing about liberal democracy is that you have a rule of law which applies to everybody. And when you decide, I want to go after him, let's find the laws to do that, that is an undermining of liberal democracy. In the midterms, Biden's kind of challenge of democracy was a kind of approach which was burn the village to save the village, right? So if you support democracy, you have to vote for us. You know, democracy is about a competition for voters. It isn't. You can't say that your candidate, that your opposition are anti-democratic. Kamala's candidacy itself, she did not win a single primary, right? She did not go through the primary process. In 2020, she didn't make it to Iowa. Tulsi Gabbard knocked her out in the televised debates by bringing up her record in California as a district attorney, and she took the candidacy over from Biden. Now, it's really important to know a little bit of the history of this, because in the 1960s, the Democratic Party democratized their system when Hubert Humphrey got the candidacy without having won any votes in the primary, and they said, look, we've got to change this. And since then, both the Democrats and the Republican Party have democratized their systems so that wouldn't happen. And now, faced with Trump, they think that they can erode those democratic norms and just put their candidate in. And so it's going back to the smoke-filled room deals which happened before, where the party leadership and the corporate donors are deciding who the candidate is and not the voters.
Great, thanks. Let's come back out for some further questions. Okay, past that, there's someone on the end of the row there. Bring this one round and start with the lady on the end of the row. Yeah.
Straightforwardly, I was wondering what the panel make of the VP choices and whether you think that either of them could move the dial at all.
The what?
VP choices, yeah.
Hi, I'm Anna Cutis, and now I haven't read all 900 pages, but I wanted to ask the opinion for the panelists. If Trump wins this election, to what extent and how quickly do you think he'll implement Project 2025?
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes, the Teamsters Union has refused to endorse Harris. It reminds me a little bit of not too long ago in this country when Unite the Union were refusing to release certain data because the upper echelons were a little bit embarrassed by about how many members were voting for UKIP. Where is organised labour in this discussion, and what does the panel think about the future of that, particularly to the American chap?
Okay, great. So this guy's got the microphone. Pass that forward just a couple of rows, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick one. I'm surprised none of the panel mentioned it in response to the question about what's at stake in this election. What happens in Ukraine after this election, particularly if Trump wins?
I shan't say much. I think you just stole my question, actually. But I suppose I'd phrase it in larger terms. I think one of the greatest things at stake is really the war in the Ukraine is emblematic of this, perhaps the biggest issue. Will the US be isolationist under Trump, and even, I think it's fair to describe him as that, Vance even more so? Or will it be continuation of the globalist, capitalist, very mainstream, well-established policies under Kamala?
Okay, great, thanks. There's this guy here.
For me, this is the most important election that I can ever remember. It may sound a bit conspiratorial, but I think there's a globalist project that's taken over the world, and practically every leader that I see in the Western world seem to be ashamed of their own country. Trump, for me, is the only person who genuinely appears to love his own country. And if he doesn't get in, goodness knows who's going to stop it all.
Okay, great.
So my question is, what role you think Elon Musk's support, quite explicit support of Trump in this election will play, and particularly if Trump does lose the election, will we see kind of a repeat of a narrative of it was some kind of suppression from the left, or it was some kind of censorship or rigging?
sorry, we'll come to the panel, then we'll come to this lady here when we come back down. Who wants to jump in?
I can go. I've got so much, though. I don't want to do them all because it will get very boring. On the VPs, well, Tim Walz is obviously just a non-entity, so we don't even need to talk about that. I mean, Trump just destroyed him at that recent roast thing, and talking about he'll claim he was here anyway and all that kind of thing. He's such a foolish and ridiculous figure, so he's to me, a sort of nothing. But Vance is very interesting because he seems to be aware of the kind of new right, sometimes called a dissident right, and he's friends with people like Curtis Yarvin. Weirdly, I have mutual acquaintances with him, if you can imagine something so horrifying. But yeah, it's so he is aware of things like there's a phrase from the Reagan administration, personnel is policy. And I think Vance is aware of things. Someone mentioned before that, I think it was Richard, that Trump didn't really get a grip of this last time. He had people around him like John Bolton, these absurd neocons. Whereas if you have someone like Vance, there's a feeling that he might get in there and realize you've got to actually gut the deep state and put people in who believe in the things that they believe in. That's on the VPs. Project 2025, I don't know loads about. I had a little look at it. Some of it looked pretty based. Some of it I wasn't sure. But Trump himself has distanced himself from it, so I'm not sure he's that bothered about it. Ukraine is interesting. There was a guy in my football team who came over from Ukraine. He thinks Trump would pause the war rather than end it. I think Trump obviously wants to end it, but whether it will come back again under another administration, that seems possible. Basically with Trump, it looks like you're going to get a very pro-Israel administration, but not so pro-Ukraine war. That's my very quick take on that. Musk, very significant. Musk kind of pulls Trump in a different direction to me. To me, he pulls him in this more libertarian direction. As I said before, he's very into high school immigration. He's very into free speech. He wants the 90s back, let's be honest. Whereas the Bannon thing, you mentioned what's happened to Bannon populism. Well, the fact that he's in jail makes it a bit harder to have influence. And we did see there was this sort of economic nationalism, isolationism. Trump's still obsessed with tariffs, so that's kind of a curveball. But with Musk, you sort of imagined it's something a lot more quasi-libertarian. And it helps just having Musk, obviously, because he's the richest man in the world. Like I say, there's a lot of things he can get done. And apparently he's going to come in and be in charge of stripping down the government, which I think we all want to see what that's going to look like. That'll be amazing. Go on.
Yeah. Stan, pick up on any of that you like. You might even want to tackle the Vance thing. One of the things that seems interesting is not necessarily the personnel thing as you've raised it, but the Vance is like this kind of oddball character that's into all these niche microcultures, and I don't know if that conflicts in a way with your idea.
Are you saying he's weird? Are you falling for the rhetoric?
Then they need to broaden out the appeal a little bit.
Into sofas.
Yeah, I think whatever one can say about Vance, I think he has been the more effective of the two vice presidential candidates at bringing support to his top of the ticket. In other words, he seems like he's better at getting out the base. I have my own kind of questions about a few different things that he might mean for policy, but I think his alignment with Trump is different than Pence's alignment was, and so, will that mean that there is a more cogent implementation of Trump's policy if Trump ever gets cogent about it himself? I don't know. I don't think Project 2025 is going to matter that much to Trump necessarily. You may see bits and pieces of it happen, but I think he doesn't like things that singe him, and that singed him in a way that obviously bothered him at the time, so I wouldn't expect to see a lot from that. I had a question from the back about where is organized labor in all this. I think that's an interesting one because the base of the Democratic Party used to be, when I first, as I grew up, was very heavily organized labor, and organized labor's role in American life has changed a lot. There's, I think, less than 6% of American private sector workers are unionized. That is not at all true in government workers, where there is a lot of union employ. And so you see that the unions still have sway. They certainly tend to speak and sound more like the government rooting for itself in a lot of ways. I think the real disconnect that has Trump peeling support off here is that in the midst of an era where capital became highly mobile, people aren't as mobile. And so if your job leaves, you just lost sometimes the capital with which to relocate. If you were on the margin, you might have just lost the capital with which to reskill. And so you see this this dynamic in towns. My family and I have driven across the country several times in the COVID era, and there are places in the country where you really can see that hollowing out. And I don't think any of us has to look very far inside our own selves to imagine what that would feel like. I grew up in a very small town of 500 people, that struggled at the end of the energy crisis in the 70s. It was rough. So I think there's going to be some mixes there. I think it's clear that Labor's leadership prefers Biden, but it looks like certainly the private sector, union rank and file, look like they favor Trump. And that may be enough to matter in a couple of pretty critical Rust Belt states.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Well, just to follow up on that, so I mean, what we're seeing is a class realignment in US politics. So the white-collar unions, the teachers' unions and so on are still very strongly Democratic. It's the blue-collar unions, the unions that represent lorry drivers and steel workers that are either unable to endorse or are rooting quietly or not so quietly for Trump. I was on my trip in the US earlier this year. I was talking to someone who was wearing a United Steelworkers cap, who worked in the Great Lakes on a ship or vessel that moved iron ore across the Great Lakes, and he was telling me about how he and all of his union brothers, term he used, were voting for Trump because of the tariffs. But this, I think, is emblematic of a longer-term trend that we've seen of a shifting class dynamic in US politics. I mean, and it's actually, if we go back to 2008, there was no class divide in that election. So Obama won, had a +7 margin with college-educated voters, or a +7 margin with non-college-educated voters, and a +8 margin with college-educated voters. So basically, there was no difference. At the last election, Biden won the college-educated vote by 18 points, but lost the non-college-educated vote by 4 points. And there are a lot more non-college-educated than college-educated people in America. There are 2/3 of American adults don't have a college degree. So that ends up kind of an even divide. The polling that I've seen in this election, looking at the New York Times' in-depth Siena poll last month, Harris was leading college-educated voters by 20 points, which would be a historic high for a Democrat, but she was losing non-college-educated voters by 16 points, which would also be an unprecedented level for a Democrat. So I think the union story is speaking to a wider story where working-class voters are leaving the Democratic Party and more middle-class and affluent voters are moving into the Democratic Party. We had the questions on Ukraine. I mean, I don't profess to be able to read the tea leaves, other than to say that I actually think that either candidate who wins will probably try to seek some kind of settlement after the election. I think that I think probably the Biden, and we may even see something before the next president comes in, where the Biden administration tries to make some kind of moves immediately after the election. It's not unheard of. I think Bill Clinton did some of this after the 2000 election for a lame duck president after an election, but before they leave office. So Biden will be president until 20th of January. There might be some movement in that period.
All right, quick one on Ukraine, and then Charles.
Yeah, quick note on Ukraine. An earlier panel today talked about Trump being a deal maker, and that we don't know what he might do to go have a conversation with Putin and Zelensky to try to bring that war to a close. But he's also going to have the same kind of conversation with congressional leadership, and even between different parts of the Democratic and Republican caucuses, respectively. There's enough support for Ukraine that I think he would have to do some deal making and horse trading there. So I don't think Trump's hand is going to be completely free, because I think you might see folks in Congress condition something Trump wants on some level of support for Ukraine. And in that case, my answer would be we muddle through.
Very good. Sharon, and then we're coming out.
I think Richard is right on this class realignment. I would just comment on the fact that the kind of groups or the blocs which the Democratic Party believe that they owned in some way and who should do as they're told, they aren't dealing very well with the loss of those voters, and they're kind of wagging their finger at them and telling them off. So this last week, the African American vote that's moving, 25% of black men are polled to support Trump in the coming election, and the Democrats, Biden had said in the last election, if you don't vote for us, you're not black, right? So, but it has a history. So Obama himself had kind of talked to black deadbeat dads, and when he was running. And Jesse Jackson famously said off mic, but the mic was still on, like that he wanted to cut his nuts off, or his kind of patronising tone, right? And he's got form on this, but he's just done it again this week and told black voters that if they don't vote for Kamala, that they are just showing how sexist they are, how they hate women and they can't bear the thought of a woman being president. That's not the way that you persuade people to vote for them, by calling them names, right? The other way that Kamala herself has tried to do it is like create this black agenda, which is basically saying, well, we're going to turn you into state-funded drug dealers, right? So that's what's going to appeal to black people. Very aspirational, right? But just on that, I just think it's very healthy for the political parties to have to compete over whether it's trade unions or whether it's the black vote, and there may be a kind of shift, whatever, but they shouldn't take them for granted, the voters. They should have to compete for them.
Okay, good. Right, anyone else want to get in? Show me some hands, and then we'll probably have to wrap. So there's the lady who I said I'd come back to. Let's get one microphone over there if we can. Or given you're going to go past this guy, let's take you and then you. But firstly, you.
Thank you. Tucker Carlson this week did a podcast with a proper old school journalist called Mark Halperin, like pre-Trump derangement syndrome, impeccable sources, non-partisan. They did all the data, all the swing state stuff. But at the end, he asked him, what do you think will happen if Trump wins? This guy came back with, there's going to be millions, tens of millions of people needing mental health support. There will be marriage breakups, there will be alcoholism, drug problems, there will be friendship breakups. So if we thought Brexit broke relationships, this has nothing. I just wondered if the panel would share that. If Trump wins, he's going to win.
Thanks. Right. This person, and then we come over that. Yeah, don't worry.
Yeah, we've been talking about some quite wide themes across the whole of the states, but someone just mentioned the swing states. It's going to be where all the action is. And I was wondering what the panel think about North Carolina and what's been going on with North Carolina in the hurricane and what that may do, as in can people vote because they're stuck without roads, and how they feel about the federal response to that disaster.
Yeah.
So for the ones in the panel that would like Trump to win, I'm just trying to understand if maybe I missed something. And let's leave the conservative versus liberal from an economic perspective out of the whole discussion. I'm just trying to understand if when he says things like people eat dogs, or when he uses his hate speech, or when he says the appalling things that he says, do you just ignore that and just think about the facts or the other things, and you think that's funny? Or did I miss something, because I think those things are just outrageous?
So we've been hearing a lot about Trump's tariffs, and it's really hard to sort of get an unbiased opinion as just...
Not for Kamala, but for cameras.
Sorry. We've been hearing a lot about Trump's tariffs, and it's quite hard to get sort of an unbiased opinion as to what that's going to do to people. Either love them or they hate them. And I was just wondering, realistically, what is it going to do to the US economy and the job market?
Great, thanks. So I'll get you to sum up in a couple of minutes. One question I wanted to throw out there was, like, Elon Musk just landed this booster in quite spectacular fashion. And that kind of threw, I think, into maybe not into the election, but at least into the consciousness, the question of, can America be great again? Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be in a Trumpist sense, but like, what would if you could fold into your remarks, obviously you've got to talk about who's going to win, what you really think, respond to some of the questions, but can you tackle this deep thing? Is there a real problem at the heart of America? What's the kind of big issue that needs to be solved? Can America, it's going to be a difficult geopolitical time, it's going to be a difficult economic time, etc., etc. Loads of money's been spent, there's a big debt, all of this, but at least for me, I always grew up thinking America was this kind of shining beacon, the city on the hill, etc., right? Has America still got that within itself to reinvent itself, or are things maybe a bit more depressing than I might paint, or Elon Musk would like to think? But might be too much of a task, but I thought it'd be important to throw out. So 2 or 3 minutes each in summing up.
So the first question was, will people go basically full Trump derangement syndrome and go mental in the streets, right? That was after the... And I actually think no. I think of course there'll be some things, but I don't think it'll be that pronounced. And the reason is, I think people don't like Harris, and I think many more people love Trump than people realize. And it's become weirdly acceptable, far more acceptable at least, to love Trump. I mean, The Undertaker loves Trump. Okay, he's come out... Did everyone see this? I don't know how familiar with wrestling you are, but it's sort of my area of expertise. So the Undertaker from the WWE, formerly WWF, came out for Trump. This is unheard of in the past, and Hulk Hogan has already come out for Trump. So these things would be unthinkable in 2016. So far more people have come out for Trump. There's a general kind of love for Trump out there now that's sort of semi-allowed these days. And I think the Democrats aren't that serious about Harris. I don't think Obama even likes it. I think they'll regroup and think about Newsom or someone in the future. And I think there'll be a general trickle down to that to the sort of plebs on the street, which I'm not saying in a negative way, of course. I mean the well-informed Democrat voters. So I think was there a question about North Carolina? Was it? I sort of missed it, but I thought, that was just another. I mean, I hate to sound so partisan. I'm very, very neutral, but but Harris was incredibly poor during that. Of course, she was doing the "Call Me Daddy" podcast. Is that what it's called? The sort of semi-pornographic podcast for the kids. So whereas Trump dealt with that far better. That was just a shocking error from her. But then they don't care about those people. So how is that surprising? And then on the just quickly on the hate speech and the eating the dogs, which is like so funny.
That was really good.
I mean, I'm sorry, I've just proved there in real time people do like that and find it funny. I mean, this was the thing. Talking about the question about, it goes back to the vibes. I mean, everyone's like, oh, Trump lost the debate. Did he? Because all everyone remembers is they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets. So, in Springfield, so that's all we remember. So, it is funny, I'm afraid, even if some in the audience don't agree. Hate speech, not a thing. The United States Constitution, the First Amendment is there to allow hate speech. I think it was even Louis Brandeis, I don't recall the exact quote, but he was a Democrat who was very big on, you've got to allow speech that you hate. That's the whole point of free speech. There's no point just saying, oh, I love puppies, oh, I agree, oh, great. I mean, that's not what we need it for. You need it precisely for what is characterized as hate speech. So we do find it funny, but we also don't believe in the concept of hate speech. And you wanted me to move on? Because I've answered all that.
Yeah.
And I can't, it's hard to me to, your last question was like the future of America. I think I answered that before. I basically think Trump arrests the decline, though I don't think I don't know if he alone can stop it. Yeah. Only I can do that. So let's end on a joke.
Let's save the applause for the end. Stand.
Okay. I would tend to agree with Nick that I don't think that the rancor back and forth is going to be as cataclysmic at a personal level, if only because people remember what Trump's administration was like, and it was more temperate or maybe less effective than what he actually said in some ways, and so I think people's memory of the Trump years, and nostalgia can remove a lot of potholes from memory lane, and maybe it's done some of that in this case. But I don't think that people who are ready to pull the lever for Trump are willing to overweight their concern about his rhetoric when they have it to what they remember from those years. I just think that's probably how that's being factored. North Carolina and the hurricane, the devastation there is incredible. That is one of the places where I think you see the difference between the states and the federal governments, that states are in charge of disaster response. The FEMA has some things that they can do, but in the main, when governors are on their game, you see them running that kind of disaster response, as you see Ron DeSantis doing in Florida. And so I think it's hard for me to know exactly how the margin works out, because the area that's most affected probably leans a little more Republican, but then the areas that people might be upset about Kamala Harris's comments about the states. I don't know how all that's going to work out. I really don't have a good read on it. Tariffs and jobs. This is a hard one to know. And again, I don't think, no matter what Trump's rhetoric is on this, I think he's going to find himself constrained by slim majorities in houses of Congress, even if he gets a trifecta. I think that's going to be a very hard thing to ram through in draconian fashion. It doesn't mean that the rhetoric is the rhetoric can still cause some harm. I'm going to end, since I'm the American, I'm going to say this. I'm going to stop with the SpaceX thing and talk about that. I think, and again, having driven around the country, and my work puts me in contact with teachers and students across the country all the time, there is a lot of concern in our country, but I still think that at base, a lot of Americans have a confidence in themselves that I think they can translate into the broader American project. You'll see it get shaken a little bit at times like this, but I think people get back to their knitting pretty quickly. And so I think we'll have our problems, as we've always had. America has survived really nasty elections. We've survived presidential assassinations. I think we can survive this one too. I expect it to be messy, because messy is what we do.
All right, thanks a lot.
I'm not an American, and I feel I'm not a cheerleader for either particular candidate. I try to take, when I teach US politics, I try to take as even a hand as possible. But I wanted to address the question that you asked, and thank you for asking it. I mean, in terms of my own personal politics, I guess I'd say I'm a kind of old-fashioned lefty. There are things that I don't like about what the Democrats have done. There are things that I think Trump has brought to the fore that are important, particularly about manufacturing jobs and the destruction of the post-industrial Midwest. But your question reminded me of a conversation I had in 2016 when I was in the United States at the time of that election. I was getting my hair cut, and I sometimes get asked what I do, and sometimes I forget to make up a different job. So when I say I teach politics, obviously the conversation turns to politics. And the barber was saying, we're talking about the election, and he said, we've got a choice between a crook and a clown. And I said, which one of those are you going to vote for? And he said, I'm going to vote for the clown, because at least he's entertaining and no one's paid for him. And I think that conversation has stayed with me. It's quite a nihilistic view of politics. It's not a conversation about what politics can do for me or how it's going to improve my life. And I think part of the Trump phenomenon is Trump is a consequence of a collapse of faith that many Americans have in many established institutions. A collapse in faith that those institutions will make any positive difference in their lives. And if you don't believe that politics can do much for you in your life or move the dial, then maybe you vote for someone who you find entertaining, or at least just winds up the people that you don't like, the people that you see are responsible for it. Mm-hmm. It's not a justification for those views, but I think that's my attempt to try to understand that perspective.
So this election is going to be decided by this handful of swing states. We know that. I think in terms of the VPs were picked on that basis, that they were trying to kind of to appeal to those swing states, to the independent voters, because you've got the states and the voters who know what team they're on, and then you have a growing number actually of independent voters, and then the swing states. I think Tim Walz in particular was picked on his vibe thing with calling them weird. It was probably a very, a clever thing. It was the one time the Democrats were able to take on that fun part of the vibes, calling them, because you can, if you can make fun of Trump rather than create fear about him as a dictator, that actually is a more effective way of taking him down. In terms of J.D. Vance, I mean, I could talk for a long time on him, which I haven't got time for. So I would just say that I really didn't like him as a candidate. I hated his book. It was really stupid, and it was very condescending towards his community. I didn't like him washing his dirty linen in public and talking about his mother and all her bad habits and everything, as though this was why the Rust Belt had all the economic problems it has. I think he's changed, and I think that he actually has been positively influenced by Trump's focus on restructuring, jobs, tariffs, these kinds of structural things, rather than the culture of poverty that he was focused on before. And I actually think VPs don't tend to have much of an impact on the outcome, but he might. I think Trump was losing until the VP debate. And I think he turned it around. There was a lot of Americans who thought, you know what, once we get this shit show out of the way, and either Harris or Trump, are finished with their presidency, we might actually have a guy who has, the ability to develop some political answers here. So I think people began to take Vance more seriously. So, possibly, I don't know. The thing, final thought, this addresses your big question, right? So if we're talking about the vibes of joy and fun, they're not the same thing as happiness. The American Declaration of Independence talks about the pursuit, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the founding ideals of the nation. Now, the pursuit of happiness depends on an active citizenry, right? It depends on, it's a promise of wealth and well-being, yes, but it's inextricably linked to personal independence, to autonomy, to control, and to having an equal voice in a democratic republic, right? Now, I think vibes are an avoidance of that. Vibes are a way of displacing any kind of sense of having an active citizenry and a real kind of democratic future. So we need to have the conversation, and we need to, I think the United States needs to kind of penetrate through the vibes, however fun or joyful they are, and find a way for solutions, because the real necessity is solutions, and the solutions can only lie with the American people and not with these clowns or these crooks. Right.
Great. Can we thank the panel?